If you've ever seen a shepherd on the Great Lakes, mahogany hull glowing like dark honey in the afternoon light, cutting through chop that would swamp a lesser boat, you are looking at something hand-built in a small factory in Niagara-on-the-Lake. At its peak, shepherd boats produced over 400 vessels a year, each one fastened with silicon bronze and finished with a dozen coats of varnish by craftsmen whose trade took years to learn. They survived the Depression, survived a fire that destroyed the original plant, survived the Second World War on Royal Canadian Navy contracts, and then, after nearly 50 years of building the finest wooden powerboats in Canada, the plant went silent for the last time. How does a company that outlasted all of that simply disappear? What happened inside those walls? Chapter 1. The Peach Farmer's Son. The Niagara Peninsula in the early 20th century was orchard country. Peach trees running in long, disciplined rows from the escarpment down toward the lake. The soil warm enough in summer to fool a fruit tree into thinking it was somewhere gentler than Canada. Beamsville sat in the middle of it, a loyalist town 20 kilometers west of St. Catharines. And in 1889, a boy named Lloyd Henry Shepherd was born there, into a family that had been working that ground since the War of 1812. His maternal grandfather had fought alongside Sir Isaac Brock and been granted 2,000 acres for the trouble. His father had tried his luck in Detroit, building carriages, failed, come home, and gone back to growing peaches. That was the pattern in Niagara. You left, you came back, you worked the land. The land didn't care what you'd tried to become somewhere else. Lloyd broke the pattern. Not all at once. He married Kathleen Marsh in 1910, had 3 children, served in the Royal Flying Corps during the First World War, and came home to St. Catharines with a set of skills that had nothing to do with peach farming. He'd learned to work with his hands at scale. The RFC built and maintained aircraft from wood, wire, and doped fabric in conditions that demanded precision under pressure, and Lloyd brought that mentality back to a rented shop in St. Catharines, where he began building truck bodies for the Dodge brothers. Large wooden structures sheathed in galvanized steel, fabricated with electric motor-powered shop equipment that was unusual for the era. Most small operations in the Niagara region were still running belt-driven tools off a single overhead shaft. Lloyd's shop was modern before it was successful. He was a Presbyterian and a member of the Independent Order of Odd Fellows, the respectable profile of a small-town Ontario tradesman who was not content to stay small. And in 1930, at the worst possible moment in economic history, he found an investor. Sidney Simonson had recently arrived from Winnipeg, a well-known and respected citizen, according to the local press, and together they formed Simonson and Shepherd Limited, building a 66 by 100-foot cinderblock factory at 207 St. Paul Street West in St. Catharines. They were going to build truck bodies. The Depression had other plans. Simonson lost interest by 1934, and the partnership dissolved. Lloyd had already been thinking ahead. He'd incorporated Shepherd Boats Limited in 1931, toying with the idea of pivoting from truck bodies to pleasure boats. But the Depression forced the project into what he called the icebox. It stayed frozen for 3 years. Then, in 1935, Lloyd Shepherd placed his first advertisement. Shepherd Boats and Equipment. Offer their new 1935 craft. The lineup was modest. A 14-foot Niagara mahogany utility, a 15.5-foot runabout, an 18.3-foot speedster, a 22-foot deluxe runabout, and a sideline as agent for Kermath marine engines from 8 to 450 horsepower. Perhaps 10 to 15 boats were built between 1935 and 1939. The federal government's 1937 industrial survey didn't list the company. Shepherd Boats existed, but barely. And here is the decision that would define everything that followed. Not the decision to build boats, but the decision about which direction to face while building them. Niagara was the worst place in southern Ontario to build pleasure boats. The serious markets, Muskoka, the Kawarthas, the Rideau, the Thousand Islands, were all hundreds of kilometers away, requiring rail shipping that ate into already thin margins. Every other Canadian wooden boat builder of the era, Ditchburn in Gravenhurst, Grivet in Orillia, Minette Shields in Bracebridge, Duke in Port Carling, had planted themselves in the middle of the cottage country lakes where their customers kept summer homes. Lloyd Shepherd looked at those builders. Then he looked across the Niagara River at the United States, and he made the opposite choice. He established a distributor in Buffalo, New York. The firm was Jeffco Marine Basin, Incorporated, owned by a Buffalo businessman named John A. Frauenheim, the acronym built from his initials. This single relationship, a Canadian builder who faced the American market across the river, rather than the Canadian one across the breadth of Ontario, would shape the company's rise, define its reputation, and 4 decades later, deliver it into the hands of a Pennsylvania acquirer who would close it down. Lloyd's son Howard had inherited his father's mechanical instincts and added something Lloyd didn't have: a racer's nerve. In the late 1930s, Howard piloted the Crandall-designed 135-class racing hull, Miss Shepherd, designed by Bruce Crandall, one of the few purpose-built racing boats to carry the Shepherd name. She was fast, she was loud, and she put the Shepherd name in front of the kind of wealthy Americans who spent summers on the Great Lakes and wanted something faster and rougher than the polished Muskoka launches their neighbors owned. Miss Shepherd would last be seen in a field north of Lindsay in 1959, abandoned. Howard would manage the production floor through the company's peak years, and the arc of his own life, helmsman, foreman, failed electrical entrepreneur, employee of his father's former subordinate, would mirror the arc of the company itself. But all of that was still ahead. In 1939, the boats were selling, the Buffalo Pipeline was open, and Lloyd Shepherd was planning a move. The St. Catharines plant was too small. He'd found a site in Niagara-on-the-Lake, a town at the mouth of the Niagara River, directly across from Fort Niagara on the American side, a place that had been the first capital of Upper Canada and had been burned by retreating American forces in December 1813. The town had history. It didn't yet have industry. The move kept getting delayed. Then, on the evening of October 10, 1940, the decision was made for him. Chapter 2: The Fire and the River. A fire broke out in the frameworks building of the St. Catharines plant. The fire department had already been dispatched to a false alarm at the nearby General Motors works. By the time they reached Shepherd's, the building was past saving. Workers managed to wheel out 2 finished hulls. Everything else burned, including a boat nearly ready for delivery, valued at $5,000. Total damages ran to $15,000 to $20,000, partly uninsured. It was the kind of blow that ends small businesses. The factory was gone. The tooling was damaged. The insurance wouldn't cover the full loss. A lesser operator would have collected what the adjuster offered and gone back to building truck bodies, or back to peach farming, or into one of the war plants that were tooling up across the Niagara Peninsula in the autumn of 1940. Lloyd Shepherd moved to Niagara-on-the-Lake instead. The new plant rose on Ricardo Street, an L-shaped building with a barn-styled roof and a small semicircular administration office tucked in the crook of the wings. The main wing became the production assembly line. The smaller wing became the varnish and finishing room. Both wings terminated at water slips that ran down to the Niagara River, where finished boats could be lowered in and test run before shipping. It was not a large factory. It was not a modern factory by the standards of Chris Craft's enormous Algonac operation across the lake in Michigan, where boats came off the line like cars. But it was Lloyd Shepherd's factory, built the way he wanted it, in a town where the river flowed past his back door and the American market sat on the other bank. The war years were lean but useful. Shepherd was too small to compete with J.J. Taylor or Minette Shields for the big Royal Canadian Navy Fairmile contracts, the mass-produced wooden patrol boats that Canadian yards turned out by the hundreds. But the company built motor torpedo boats for the RCN, and wartime production taught Lloyd's small crew the discipline of deadlines, specifications, and government inspection that peacetime boat building rarely demanded. The last civilian project before war overtook the order book was the 65-foot wooden ketch Niagara Southwind, the largest sailboat Shepherd ever built. She survived into the 1960s, ended her days in a New Orleans yard, and was damaged by Hurricane Katrina in 2005. When the war ended, Lloyd moved fast. On April 19, 1945, Shepard announced plans to buy adjacent waterfront land and install a 100-ton crane for yacht storage, aiming eventually to employ 60 people. The crane never came. But the ambition was real, and so was the insight behind it. The war was ending. A generation of men who'd spent years in military service were coming home with money in the bank and an appetite for recreation. And Canada's lakes, 5 of them the largest freshwater bodies on Earth, were about to become the playground of the post-war middle class. By 1949, the company employed about 25 people, all building runabouts. That year brought the contract that put Shepard on the map. The Ontario Provincial Police needed patrol boats, fast, tough, capable of handling the open water of Lake Timiskaming and the big Ontario lakes where bootleggers and poachers still operated in remote bays. Shepard delivered 2 22-foot deluxe sedan runabouts, the Temagami and the Kenora. They were mahogany planked, heavy, built for the kind of water that killed flimsy boats, and they performed exactly as advertised. The Temagami survives today, restored, on display at the OPP Museum in Orillia. A patrol boat that outlived the company that built it by nearly half a century. And then, in 1950, Lloyd Shepard took his boats to the New York National Boat Show. He stole the show with rave reviews. The Jafco distributorship expanded to include multiple Midwest dealers. Suddenly, the tiny Niagara-on-the-Lake shop was building boats that wealthy Americans wanted to buy. Not because they were cheap, but because they were different from anything coming out of Michigan or Maryland. The difference was water. The dominant Canadian builders, Ditchburn, Grivet, Minette Shields, Duke, built for inland lakes, Muskoka, the Kawarthas, Georgian Bay on a calm day. Those were sheltered waters, and the boats designed for them reflected it. Sleek, relatively low-sided, beautifully finished, perfect for a calm afternoon on the cottage lake. Shepard, exposed to Lake Ontario and Lake Erie, built differently. Higher freeboards, deeper V-hulls, beamy, handsome craft with rounded garboards and heavy fastenings, silicon bronze screws through steam-bent white oak ribs into Honduras mahogany planking. One dealer's description has never been improved upon: a deep water boat. That was Shepard's competitive moat. Chris Craft and Algonac built thousands of runabouts a year on an assembly line. Beautiful boats, well-marketed, available in every marina from Lake Michigan to Long Island Sound. But a Chris Craft was a lake boat. A Shepard was a Great Lakes boat. Lake Ontario, Lake Erie, Lake Huron, Lake Michigan. These aren't lakes in the Muskoka sense. They're inland seas. They generate 3 to 5 foot chop in a stiff westerly. They freeze for months. They've swallowed ore carriers. The Edmund Fitzgerald went down in Lake Superior in 1975, with 29 men aboard, in waves that ran 35 feet. You didn't take a light-built runabout into that water. You took a Shepard. The second innovation was the V-drive. In the mid-1930s, a British automotive engineer had developed a V-drive transmission for Sir Malcolm Campbell's Bluebird speed record boat. The V-drive relocated the engine from the center of the hull to a position near the transom, with a reverse direction shaft driving the propeller. The result was transformative. The cockpit opened up. Passengers could sit together, amidships, without climbing over an engine box. The runabout stopped being a wet, loud sporting machine and became a vehicle for socializing, for taking 6 or 8 people out on the lake with the wind in their hair and enough room to pass a drink without standing up. Shepard was one of the first builders to adapt the V-drive to pleasure boats. It was a genuine engineering advantage, and it showed. Chapter 3. Mahogany and Varnish. By the early 1950s, the Ricardo Street plant had found its rhythm. Walk through the front office, the semicircular administration building tucked in the crook of the L, and you entered the main production wing, where the smell hit you first. Honduras mahogany has a scent unlike any other construction wood. Sweet, slightly dusty, warm even when the wood is cold. Nothing like the sharp, resinous bite of pine or the chalky dryness of white oak. That scent saturated the production hall the way coal dust saturated a steel town. It was in the workers' clothes when they went home. It was in their hair. Their wives knew it. Their children knew it. Years later, Anyone who'd worked at Shepherd could walk into a room where mahogany was being cut and be 25 years old again, standing at a bench on Ricardo Street with sawdust in their cuffs. The production floor ran in 2 lines, each flowing toward its own water slip at the back of the property. A hull began as white oak frames bent over forms, the stringers, the skeleton of the boat. Then the mahogany planking went on, plank by plank, each one fitted and fastened with silicone bronze screws that wouldn't corrode in fresh water the way steel or brass eventually would. The ribs were steam bent, pulled from a steam box where they'd been softened to the flexibility of leather, then curved against the hull mold and screwed into place before they cooled and stiffened. The sound of the shop was layered. The high whine of bandsaws cutting mahogany stock, the lower growl of table saws ripping planks to width, the irregular thud of jigging mallets persuading frames into their curves, and underneath it, all the hiss of the steam boxes breathing out moist heat into a building that, in a Niagara winter, needed every degree it could get. Construction time varied by model, from 2 weeks for a small utility to 12 weeks for the larger cruisers. But every boat, regardless of size, passed through the same final stage, the varnish bay. The finishing room occupied the smaller wing of the L. If the production hall smelled of warm wood, the varnish bay smelled of chemistry. The sharp, solvent-heavy bite of marine spar varnish, a smell that clung to the back of your throat and lingered in your sinuses for hours after you left. Workers in the varnish bay applied a minimum of a dozen coats of marine spar varnish over filler, hand sanding between each coat with progressively finer grits until the surface was glass smooth, and the grain of the mahogany glowed through the finish like something lit from within. A freshly varnished Shepherd hull in good light had the warmth of amber and the depth of dark honey, and the reflection off that finish was sharp enough to read a newspaper in. That finish was Shepherd's signature. It was also Shepherd's constraint, because every one of those 12-plus coats took time, took skill, and took a craftsman who knew the difference between a finish that would last 5 seasons on open water and one that would check and peel after 2. In 1952, a young man walked into that shop for the first time. George Hinterhuller had been born in Austria, where he'd learned the boat carpenter's trade at the Frauscher Yard, one of the oldest and most respected boat builders in the Alpine Lake Country. He'd emigrated to Canada at 24 years old, carrying, by his own account, a box full of tools, a training in boat building, and $30 in my pocket. A fellow Austrian translated for him at his hiring interview with Lloyd Shepherd. What Hinterhuller found at Ricardo Street impressed him. This was a model boat yard, he wrote later, and the premier powerboat builder in Canada. That verdict, from a man trained in one of Europe's finest yards, a man who would go on to become one of the most influential boat builders in Canadian history, is the most authoritative assessment of Shepherd's quality that exists in the documented record. Hinterhuller wasn't a journalist writing a puff piece. He wasn't a dealer talking up his product line. He was a trained craftsman evaluating the shop he'd just been hired into, and he called it the best in the country. He also, privately, wished he were building sailboats. "Powerboats were not my love," he wrote. In his garage, on his own time, Hinterhuller built Y-Flyer sailboats, small, elegant racing dinghies that were everything a mahogany runabout was not: light, wind-driven, quiet. His colleague on the Shepherd floor was Gordon Brinsmead, a foreman who shared Hinterhuller's craftsmanship, if not his Austrian accent. Together they formed one of those partnerships that factories sometimes produce: 2 men whose skills complement each other, who talk over lunch about what they'd build if they could build anything, who are loyal to their employer, but restless in a way that loyalty can't quite contain. But that restlessness was years away from mattering. In 1952, Hinterhuller and Brinsmead were building mahogany powerboats at the best yard in the country, and the boats they were building were selling as fast as they could finish them. Chapter 4. The Boats and the Border. The 1950 model lineup told you everything about where Shepherd sat in the market. At the entry level, the 17-foot utility convertible, powered by a gray Phantom 6-cylinder at 125 horsepower, or a Chrysler Ace at 112, sold for roughly $3,000. The 22-foot Sportsman utility, the volume seller, ran a Chrysler Crown 140 or a gray Fireball 6 and listed at about $5,000. The 18-foot deluxe V-drive, engine at the stern, the cockpit opened up, sat at $3,750. The 22-foot V-drive ran the Chrysler Crown, and at the top, the 27-foot Express Cruiser, the flagship, carried twin Chrysler Crowns, slept two, and listed at $11,950 fully fitted. That was roughly 50% more than the comparable Grivet Streamliner, and the performance data justified every dollar of the premium. Fuel consumption was quoted at 5,000 feet to the gallon, which meant you could run all afternoon on a tank that would empty a lighter boat in an hour. To understand the price, you have to understand the product. A Shepherd wasn't a boat you ordered from a catalog and picked up at the marina. It was a constructed object: frames, planks, ribs, fasteners, engine, hardware, varnish, each one handled by a man whose trade took years to learn. The 1949 OPP contract boats, the Temagami and the Kenora, had been built to police specifications: fast enough to run down smugglers, tough enough to operate in the open water of northern Ontario lakes where weather could turn inside 20 minutes. Those boats weren't pretty objects for cottage dock display. They were working tools built to a standard that the provincial police found acceptable, and the OPP didn't accept inadequate equipment. When one of those boats still exists 7 decades later, restored and displayed in a museum, the quality of the original construction is not a marketing claim. It's a verifiable fact. By the mid-1950s, the export pipeline through Jafco Marine Basin had opened into a network of Midwest dealers, and the boats were finding their way to Lake Charlevoix, the Les Chenaux Islands of Lake Huron, Lake Geneva in Wisconsin, and the long chain of American waterways that ran from the Great Lakes down through the canal system to the eastern seaboard. In 1954, a 27-foot cruiser called the Stampeder was shipped by rail from Niagara-on-the-Lake all the way to Okanagan Lake in British Columbia. 4 years later, when Princess Margaret visited Kelowna for the opening of the floating bridge, she was entertained aboard the Stampeder. The boat was renamed the Shepherd, passed through 4 generations of one family, and is still afloat today. Shepherd sponsored a women's baseball team in 1949. A photograph survives in the Niagara-on-the-Lake Museum, the team in matching jerseys, standing in front of the Ricardo Street plant in the summer light. Nobody in the photograph is identified. The names are gone. The jerseys are gone. The plant is gone. The photograph remains. The factory at its peak employed perhaps 50 to 60 people, a guess based on Lloyd's post-war projection of 60 and the modest expansion of the 1950s. They weren't building 400 inboard runabouts a year. That figure, from the Niagara-on-the-Lake Museum's exhibit, likely includes the smaller outboard kits and the 16-foot ski bee that Shepherd introduced in 1956 for the booming water skiing market. Inboard runabout production was probably dozens per year, not hundreds. But every one of those boats left the Ricardo Street slips with a dozen coats of varnish, silicon bronze fasteners, steam-bent ribs, and the kind of fit and finish that made George Hinterholer, a man trained in the Austrian tradition, call it the best in Canada. The American competition was formidable and getting more so. Chris Craft of Algonac was the colossus. Thousands of boats a year, a national dealer network, a marketing machine that made wooden runabouts aspirational consumer goods, in the way that Detroit made cars aspirational consumer goods. Century, Garwood, Hacker, Owens of Baltimore. The American field was deep, well-capitalized, and relentless on styling. By the mid-1950s, Chris Craft's two-tone Holiday and Continental models, bleached mahogany decks over dark hulls, chrome hardware flashing in the sun, were setting the visual language of the American runabout market, and Shepherd had no choice but to respond. In 1956, the company adopted its own bleached mahogany and dark brown two-tone scheme, adding a distinctive leaf/hull-side decoration that became the visual signature of the late Shepherd runabout. It was a handsome treatment. It was also a defensive move. The design initiative had passed to the Americans, and a 50-person shop in Niagara-on-the-Lake was following where a 5,000-person factory in Michigan led. That same year, a British Channel swimmer named Brenda Fisher visited the Shepherd Works. She was photographed beside the boats, a minor celebrity moment, the kind of thing a small-town factory framed and hung in the front office. It was 1956. Lloyd Shepherd was 67 years old. His boats had never been better. His name had never been better known. His son Howard was managing the floor. Hinterhuller and Brinsmead were producing the finest work of their careers. And the thing about peaks is that nobody standing on one believes the ground can shift. Chapter 5. The Summit. The peak years, 1953 to 1957, had a quality that only becomes visible in retrospect. Everything was working. The 22-foot Sportsman was the heart of the lineup, a boat that combined the Shepherd virtues: deep V-hull, heavy construction, the open V-drive cockpit, that luminous varnish finish, into a package that sold on site at boat shows from New York to Chicago. The dealer network stretched across the American Midwest. The JAFCO relationship was solid. The OPP patrol boats had given the brand a credibility that no amount of advertising could have purchased. And the product itself, the physical object, the thing you could touch and smell and hear when the Chrysler Crown turned over and the exhaust burbled through the transom, was as good as anything on the Great Lakes, Canadian or American. Lloyd Shepherd, nearing 70, had built something remarkable from a cinderblock truck body shop and a borrowed investor's stake. A company that had survived the Depression, survived the 1940 fire, survived the war years on RCN contracts, and emerged into the post-war boom with a reputation that even a European-trained craftsman called the finest in Canada. James M. Hahn, the St. Catharines businessman who would buy the company in 1958, later told newspaper reporters that Shepherd's yearly output exceeded 400 vessels at its peak. Even adjusted for the outboard kits and the skibby, that was a remarkable throughput for a custom shop running 2 production lines with a few dozen workers on a dead-end street in a town best known for its 19th-century theater. But warnings were visible to anyone who chose to look. The workforce hadn't scaled. Still 25 in 1949, perhaps 50 to 60 a decade later. This was a custom shop, not a manufacturer, and the gap between Shepherd's output and Chris Craft's output was the gap between a cabinet maker and a furniture factory. In 1955, Chris Craft introduced the Cobra, a fiberglass-hulled runabout. Fiberglass, a material that could be popped from a female mold in days, required no steam bending, no 12-coat varnish regime, no silicon bronze fastenings, no supply chain of Honduras mahogany from Central American forests. A material that customers didn't need to re-varnish every spring, didn't need to re-caulk, didn't need to haul out of the water in autumn and store in a heated shed to prevent the planks from drying and opening their seams. The Chris Craft Cobra wasn't as beautiful as a mahogany Shepherd. It wasn't as well built, but it was a signal. The largest powerboat manufacturer in the world was hedging its bets on wood. And in 1958, George Hinterhuller and Gordon Brinsmead walked out the door. The 2 men left Shepherd to form Hinterhuller Limited. Hinterhuller had been building sailboats in his garage for years. Now he'd build them professionally, and the company he founded would, within a decade, merge into C&C Yachts, the largest sailboat builder in Canadian history. The defection took from Shepherd its most skilled craftsman and one of its most experienced foremen. It was the quiet kind of loss. No drama, no public dispute. Just 2 men who'd been talking over lunch for 6 years about what they'd build if they could build anything, finally going out to build it. Lloyd Shepherd was 68 in 1957. He was tired. Howard was capable, but hadn't been groomed for ownership. He was a production man, a floor manager, a racer. Neither of Lloyd's daughters, Zita Hallett and Mary Bench, had entered the business. His 6 grandchildren showed no inclination toward boat building. The Shepherd family had run the company for 2 generations, 1928 to 1958. That was all. Lloyd retired and sold to James M. Hahn of St. Catharines. The researcher Richard Crowder is blunt about what is known of Hahn. My research has not determined his background or motivation. He was described later and vaguely as a boat builder. What Hahn did immediately upon taking control was clear. He pivoted from runabouts to cruisers, expanding the line to 25 and then 45 feet within 2 years, building a coast-to-coast Canadian dealer organization, and repositioning the company as, by his own claim, Canada's largest inboard cruiser manufacturer, by dollar and by unit. The pivot was correct in its market reading. Bigger boats meant bigger margins. The cruiser market was booming. Americans wanted floating living rooms with galleys and sleeping quarters, not open runabouts that soaked you to the waist in a following sea. But bigger boats meant bigger exports to the United States. Bigger exports meant deeper exposure to American demand, American distribution, American buying patterns, and American acquirers. The year was 1958. The runabout was still in production. The Varnish Bay was still operating. The Mahogany was still arriving from Honduras. Howard Shepard was still managing the floor, though the company was no longer his family's. Everything was about to change, and none of it would change quickly enough to see it coming. Chapter 6. The border opens. To understand what happened next, you have to understand how the Canadian wooden boat industry died. It didn't die all at once. It died the way a shoreline erodes, one season at a time, each loss too small to notice until the ground you're standing on isn't there anymore. By 1960, aluminum and fiberglass boats had completely invaded the wood speedboat market. A fiberglass hull could be popped from a female mold in a matter of days. Lay up the glass cloth, wet it with resin, let it cure, pop it out, and you had a hull that was structurally identical to the last one and the next one. No steam bending, no hand-fitting planks, no 12-coat varnish regime, no silicon bronze fasteners at $1 apiece, no Honduras mahogany shipped from Central America on a supply chain that was getting longer and less reliable every year. And the maintenance equation was devastating. A mahogany boat needed annual bottom fairing, recaulking, and revarnishing, weeks of skilled work every spring before the boat touched water. A fiberglass boat could be hosed off and launched. For the weekend boater who wanted to spend his Saturdays on the lake rather than in the boathouse with a sanding block, the choice wasn't even close. The skilled labor market that built wooden hulls was aging out. Hinterhuller had been the rare 24-year-old immigrant in 1952, a young man trained in the European tradition, arriving at precisely the moment when Canada still had work for his hands. A decade later, there was no apprentice pipeline. The old hands at Shepard, at Grivet, at Ditchburn, at Duke, the men who could read a plank's grain and know where it would bend and where it would break, who could fit a garboard to a keel by feel, who could judge the tack of a varnish coat by touching it with the back of one finger. Those men were in their 50s and 60s. Nobody was replacing them. The trade schools weren't teaching wooden boat construction. The young men coming into the workforce wanted factory jobs with union wages and pensions, not artisan work in a drafty boathouse for a family-owned company that might not outlast its founder. Across the Canadian wooden boat world, the lights were going out. Grivet in Orillia was struggling. Ditchburn and Gravenhurst had already faded. Minette Shields in Bracebridge was restructuring. Duke in Port Carling was contracting. The entire ecosystem, the Muskoka displacement launches, the Peterborough canoes, the planing hull runabouts, was being hollowed out by the same forces, fiberglass hulls that were cheaper to build, cheaper to maintain, and available in volumes that no custom shop could match. And the tariff wall that had protected Canadian builders from American competition, the shipping costs, the border duties, the preference of Canadian cottage owners for Canadian-built boats, was eroding as American fiberglass boats became so cheap that even with the duties, they undercut Canadian wood. Hans' response was to go bigger. The cruiser line he introduced after 1958 was still wood, Honduras mahogany over white oak frames, the same construction that had made Shepard's reputation. But cruisers at 25, 30, 35, 45 feet were a different business from 22-foot runabouts. They took longer to build. They cost more. They sold to a wealthier, more demanding customer who expected galleys, heads, sleeping quarters, engine rooms, electrical systems, the complexity of a small house compressed into a hull that had to survive open water. And they sold overwhelmingly to Americans. The domestic Canadian market for a 45-foot mahogany cruiser was a handful of buyers a year. The American market, accessible through JAFCO and the expanding dealer network, was where the volume lived. Hans' pivot was strategically sound. He was reading the market correctly. The runabout was dying, the cruiser was growing, and the money was in the United States. By the early 1960s, he claimed Shepherd was Canada's largest inboard cruiser manufacturer by dollar and by unit. The boast may have been accurate. It was also a confession. The company's survival now depended entirely on American customers buying Canadian boats at premium prices. The moment an American company decided it could build the same product more cheaply on its own side of the border, or simply buy the Canadian operation and fold it into an American production network, the game was over. That moment arrived in October 1966. Chapter 7. The Trojan Horse. The Trojan Boat Company had one of the great American origin stories, the kind that would have made Lloyd Shepherd nod with recognition. On December 31, 1948, two men drove from Pennsylvania to Troy, New York, and paid $4,000 for the assets of the failed Cottrell Spur Boat Works. James R. Jim McQueen was a Second World War P-51 Mustang fighter pilot, a man who'd flown combat missions over Europe and come home with a restlessness that peacetime employment couldn't satisfy. Harper Hull was a University of Michigan-trained naval architect who could design the boats McQueen wanted to sell. They loaded the equipment into a truck, drove it back to Pennsylvania, and set it up in a rented dairy barn in York, drawing on the Pennsylvania Dutch and Amish workforce, communities whose woodworking traditions ran as deep as any in North America. The third founder was Ernie Warner, the production manager, who mortgaged his house and cashed in his life insurance to take his stake. That detail tells you everything about the scale of the gamble. A man betting his family's security on a boat company started in a barn. Within a year, they'd relocated to a 26-acre site at 167 Greenfield Road in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, occupying a 142,000-square-foot factory. The 1954 Trojan Sea Breeze generated 800 orders. By the 1960s, the 31-foot Sea Voyager had become the company's signature. 10,000 of those wooden family cruisers were produced over the next decade. The 33-foot Express Cruiser appeared on Lloyd Bridges' Sea Hunt, the television show that made boating aspirational for an entire generation of American families. By 1968, Trojan facilities in Lancaster, Elkton in Maryland, and Niagara-on-the-Lake had made Trojan the second-largest producer of inboard boats in the world, employing more than 700 people across the plants. But Trojan had a problem, and the problem had a name: Jim McQueen. McQueen hated fiberglass. His production manager's son, Larry Warner, told historian Bob Cushman in a January 2001 interview that Jim McQueen never liked fiberglass. He thought it was a fad. Signs in the Lancaster office reportedly read, "If God had intended there to be fiberglass boats, he would have made fiberglass trees." It was a good line. It was also a strategic disaster. By the mid-1960s, every major American boat builder was converting to fiberglass or going under. And Trojan, the second-largest inboard builder in the world, was still committed to plywood and mahogany construction because its founder couldn't accept that the market had moved. This was why Trojan bought Shepherd. The deal closed in October 1966. The price was never publicly disclosed. What the deal gave Trojan was twofold: access to Canadian and British Commonwealth markets that American-built boats couldn't easily enter, and a luxury 52-foot yacht that Shepherd had developed under Hahn, a product at the top end of the market where wood construction still commanded a premium. Brian Nolan, in his 1981 history, The Trojan Wars, put it plainly. The deal gave Trojan access to Canadian and British Commonwealth markets. The move also gave Trojan a luxury 52-footer that soon found favor with American buyers. For the workers at Ricardo Street, the acquisition landed with the particular anxiety that accompanies any foreign takeover of a Canadian plant. Helen Rockwell, who worked in the Trojan Shepherd payroll office, recalled the workforce being apprehensive about the takeover. The apprehension was justified by history. Canadian workers had learned, across dozens of industries and decades of branch plant economics, that when an American company bought a Canadian factory, the promises came first, and the rationalization came after. But Rockwell was pleasantly surprised. Trojan introduced incentive piecework and profit sharing. They brought in an early IBM computer for payroll, a novelty that must have seemed almost comically modern in a factory that still smelled of mahogany shavings and marine varnish. "It was the happiest job I ever had," Rockwell said. She was in the payroll office. The men in the varnish bay had a different experience. The most prestigious product line, the wooden runabouts that Lloyd Shepherd had built his reputation on, the 22-foot Sportsman, the deep V hulls that smashed through Great Lakes, chopped like no other boat on the water, was canceled within 18 months of the acquisition. By 1968, Shepherd's wooden runabout line was dead. The small boats, the boats that had stolen the show at the 1950 New York Boat Show, the boats that the OPP had trusted to patrol the northern lakes, the boats that George Hinterhuler had called the product of the premier powerboat builder in Canada, gone. Not because they weren't good, because they weren't fiberglass. The irony was exquisite, and it was tragic. Jim McQueen, the man who hated fiberglass so much he posted signs mocking it on his office walls, had bought a Canadian wooden boat builder precisely because he wanted to stay in the wood business. And within 2 years, the wooden runabouts were gone anyway. Killed not by McQueen's decision, but by the market that McQueen had spent a decade refusing to acknowledge. Trojan had acquired Shepherd because Trojan was behind on fiberglass. The combined company still lacked the capital to retool. The wooden runabout died in the gap between McQueen's stubbornness and the industry's direction. What replaced it was a hybrid. Fiberglass hulls with wooden decks, superstructure, and interiors. Trojan initially contracted a local company making bathtubs near Lancaster to produce the fiberglass molds. The bathtub detail carries its own weight. A craft tradition that had taken decades to build, the steam bending, the bronze fastenings, the 12-coat varnish, was being replaced by technology borrowed from bathroom fixtures. Chapter 8. The Conglomerate and the Closing. What killed the wooden Shepherd runabout was Jim McQueen's resistance to fiberglass. What killed Shepherd itself was what happened next. McQueen couldn't finance the conversion to fiberglass from Trojan's own revenue. The company was the second-largest inboard builder in the world, but it had spent the 1960s building wooden boats while its competitors tooled up for fiberglass, and the capital required to retool 4 plants, Lancaster, Elkton, Niagara-on-the-Lake, and a new facility, was beyond what a family-owned boat company could generate. McQueen needed outside money. In 1969, he found it. Whittaker Corporation was a Los Angeles conglomerate built during the 1960s acquisition frenzy, the era when American corporate finance discovered that you could buy unrelated companies, bundle them into a single entity, and watch the stock price rise on the sheer momentum of growth. At its peak, Whittaker operated 80 companies with total sales of $753.4 million. Its chairman, William Duke, had built the company from an obscure Los Angeles firm into a complex that spanned marine, defense, chemicals, metals, and technology. Whittaker's Marine Group alone, at its peak, included Bertram Yacht, Trojan Yachts, Riva, Desco Marine, Kettenberg, Balboa Marine, and Coronado Yachts, with total sales between $250 and $350 million. McQueen gave up his ownership of the firm in 1969 to finance the transition. That sentence, recorded in the official company history, deserves its full weight. A man who'd started a boat company in a rented dairy barn with a mortgaged house and a cashed-in life insurance policy, who'd built it into the second-largest inboard builder in the world, surrendered ownership because he'd spent 15 years refusing to build fiberglass boats and now couldn't afford to start. McQueen and Hull both left Trojan in the 1970s. The dairy barn, the $4,000 purchase, the P-51 pilot's restlessness, the fiberglass trees signs, all of it folded into a line item on a Los Angeles conglomerate's balance sheet. Joseph F. Alibrandi became Whittaker's president in 1970. Under Whittaker, the Niagara-on-the-Lake plant, now operating as Trojan Canada, still legally Shepherd Boats Limited, was progressively converted. The wooden Shepherd runabout had already been canceled in 1968. The cruiser line was transitioning to fiberglass hulls with wooden superstructures. The 52-foot yacht that Trojan had acquired in the deal became the basis for the larger Sea Voyager line. The 1969 42-foot Sea Voyager Marriage, built at Niagara-on-the-Lake, was representative of the hybrid product. Fiberglass below the waterline, wood above it. A boat with an identity crisis. Too modern to be a Shepherd, too traditional to be a Trojan. Made in Canada for a Pennsylvania company owned by a Los Angeles conglomerate. And then the institutional memory began to disappear. When Whitaker restructured the combined Trojan-Shepherd operation, the historical records went with it. In the restructuring, one researcher noted, the historical information and materials were most likely discarded, as little information can be found today. The plans, the construction drawings, the patterns from which the mahogany hull shapes had been taken, the jigs that held the frames in position during planking, the accumulated knowledge of 2 generations of boat building, how Lloyd Shepherd had bent his first oak frames, how the varnish bay had been set up, what the tolerances were on a 22-foot hull, where the bronze fasteners went, and at what spacing. All of it, gone. Not burned, like the St. Catharines plant in 1940. Just discarded. Thrown out during an office move, or boxed and warehoused and then lost when the warehouse changed hands, or simply deemed irrelevant by a conglomerate that built boats from molds and didn't need the patterns of a craft tradition it had already abandoned. Lars Bergerson, who would later acquire the Shepherd name, confirmed the loss. I can't find any plans or patterns anywhere. In 1973, Whitaker expanded. Trojan Canada bought a 47,000 square foot plant in Smithville, Ontario, a former facility of Examet Incorporated, for $750,000. The plan was to produce the Trojan 24-foot tri-cabin and supporting cruisers, with a projected workforce of 200 at full operation. They also ran a small 17-person Trojan plant on Montrose Road in Niagara Falls, and they tried to expand the original Ricardo Street plant. Trojan Canada applied to the town of Niagara-on-the-Lake for rezoning to permit the expansion. The town refused. That refusal is one of those moments that seems small in the record, but resonates through everything that followed. Niagara-on-the-Lake, by the mid-1970s, had chosen its identity. The Shaw Festival had been founded in 1962. The wine industry was growing. The town's future was heritage tourism, theater, and the kind of genteel weekend visits that brought money from Toronto without bringing factories or shift workers. When the company that had employed the town's residents for 35 years asked to expand, the town that had defined itself around preservation said no. It was a choice between 2 versions of Niagara-on-the-Lake, the working town that built boats and the heritage town that sold tickets, and the heritage town won. The irony is that the working town disappeared anyway. The refusal to rezone didn't save Shepherd. It just ensured that when the closure came, Niagara-on-the-Lake had already declared where its loyalties lay. By 1977, the long post-war boat boom was over. The 1973 oil crisis had cratered demand for the fuel-thirsty engines that powered Trojan's cruiser line. Gas prices had quadrupled. The recreational boater, who'd happily burned 50 gallons on a Saturday afternoon in 1970, was doing the maths in 1977 and leaving the boat on its trailer. Whitaker's senior management concluded it was becoming less practical to manufacture the boats in Canada for use in the United States. The exchange rate, the shipping costs, the border. The same border that Lloyd Shepherd had faced in 1935. The same border that had fed Jeffco Marine Basin. The same border that had made Shepherd's American customers possible. That border now made the Canadian plant expendable. The announcement came. Shepherd Boats Limited would close its 2 plants in the Niagara Peninsula on February 28, 1978. The workers made an offer to buy the factory. Stephen Fox, the historian who documented the Ontario boat-building tradition, recorded the attempt in a single line. Facing the end, the employees made an offer to buy the works. This was turned down. No organizer named. No price stated. No Whitaker executive identified as the person who said no. Just a sentence. The entire documented record of a workforce trying to save the place where they'd spent their working lives. Lloyd Shepherd had died in 1968, the year the wooden runabout was canceled. Howard was working at C&C Yachts, under George Hinterhuler, his father's former employee, the man who'd arrived at the Shepherd factory 26 years earlier with $30 and a box of Austrian tools. Howard was ill. He would die later in 1978, the same year the plant closed. He was 65. Neither of Lloyd's daughters was involved. The Shepherd family was, by 1978, external to the decision, spectators to the demolition of their own legacy. Chapter 9. The Last Yacht. The last project at the Ricardo Street plant was a 54-foot luxury cruiser called the Ozark Star. She was white and gold, one of 5 Star Series yachts built that year. Fiberglass hull, the wooden era was long past. Teak interior finish, twin 415 cubic inch diesel engines. She slept 6. Her value was $275,000. She had taken 6,000 man-hours to build. The Ozark Star was completed in January 1978, but held at the plant for customization. In the final days, the last hours of Shepherd Boats as a working factory, the finishing crew installed the luxury items: a washer and dryer, a dishwasher, a stereo, a television, a bar, an ice maker, king-sized baths, one on the main deck and one in the guest room, a 4-piece bath in the master bedroom, amenities for a Missouri family with property at the Lake of the Ozarks near St. Louis. The workers who installed that dishwasher and that ice maker and that king-sized bath knew the plant was closing. They'd known since the announcement. They'd watched their offer to buy the works get turned down by executives in Los Angeles who'd never walked the production floor, never smelled the mahogany, never stood at the water slips watching a finished hull slide into the Niagara River for its test run. And they installed the dishwasher anyway. They finished the job. The plant closed on schedule, February 28, 1978. The Smithville plant closed simultaneously. The paperwork was boxed up and moved out. The tooling, the patterns, the construction jigs, all of it was either discarded or lost. Nothing has been recovered by later researchers. Total layoffs across the Niagara Peninsula plants are not precisely documented, but the Smithville projection of 200 jobs, plus the Montrose Road tally of 17, plus the Niagara-on-the-Lake headcount, suggests the combined direct loss was in the low hundreds. Wooden boat production at the parent company, Trojan, had already ended in 1974. Between 1958 and 1974, roughly 65,000 wooden boats had been produced across all Trojan plants. Now, even the fiberglass line was contracting. The Ozark Star was shipped from Niagara-on-the-Lake on May 20, 1978, nearly 3 months after the factory had closed. She went to Missouri. The factory she'd been built in went silent. Chapter 10. The Condominiums and the Corpses. The Ricardo Street plant stood vacant for several years. For a time, it stored costumes for the Shaw Festival, the theater company whose existence had helped define the town's identity as a heritage destination, the same identity that had driven the refusal to rezone. For another period, the building served as workspace for the production of Trivial Pursuit, the board game, invented in Montreal, that became one of the best-selling games in history. The factory that had built mahogany runabouts for Princess Margaret's entertainment became, briefly, the factory that assembled trivia cards. In the 1980s, the plant was demolished. In its place rose Kings Point, a waterfront condominium complex developed by Eric Moog, designed by Gabor, Popper, and Northgrave architects, and built by Daniels Corporation. 2 Art Deco-inspired, wedge-shaped 3-story brick buildings, 90 luxury suites, an outdoor heated saltwater pool, a jacuzzi, award-winning gardens, underground parking, a Muskoka chair terrace overlooking the Niagara River. The light yellow brick color and the courtyard picket fence were specified by the local Architectural Advisory Committee to preserve sight lines between Fort George on the Canadian side and Fort Niagara on the American side, the same 2 forts that had faced each other across the river since the 18th century, the same river that Lloyd Shepherd's boats had slipped into for their test runs. There is no plaque. The old pump house building survives. It was converted into an art gallery, what Stephen Fox, the historian, described with quiet precision as a venue designed to pull in the moneyed tourists in town for the Shaw Festival. a heated saltwater pool, and a Muskoka chair terrace. That is what sits on the ground, where two production lines once ran toward the Niagara River, where the smell of Honduras mahogany and marine varnish saturated the air, where George Hinterheller arrived with $30 and a box of tools, where the OPP's Temagami was built, where the varnish bay turned raw mahogany into something that glowed like dark honey in the afternoon light. Muskoka chairs, overlooking the river, where the boats used to go in. Howard Shepard died in 1978. George Hinterheller continued to build sailboats at C&C Yachts, the company he and Brinsmead had founded after leaving Shepard in 1958, until April 21, 1994, when a catastrophic fire at the C&C plant in Niagara-on-the-Lake destroyed 40 molds and the boats under construction, including 3 C&C 51s. The fire that had driven Lloyd Shepard from St. Catharines to Niagara-on-the-Lake in 1940 had its echo 54 years later in the same town, destroying the life's work of a man who'd learned his trade on Lloyd's shop floor. In 1996, the C&C brand and its intellectual materials were acquired by Fairport Yachts of Fairport, Ohio. Today, the C&C plant site is the Pillar and Post Inn Gardens, another factory, another set of condominiums, another Canadian boat-building tradition sold to an American company and relocated across the border. Hinterheller died in 1999. The man who'd called Shepard the premier powerboat builder in Canada never saw the brand revived. But the boats survived. That's the thing about a well-built wooden boat. It outlasts the company, the workforce, the town, and the era that produced it. Shepards remain afloat across Muskoka, Georgian Bay, the Rideau, the St. Lawrence, the American Midwest, Lake Geneva, Lake Charlevoix, the Les Chenaux Islands of Lake Huron, and the Lake of the Ozarks, where the Ozark Star ended her journey. The Stampeder, the boat that carried Princess Margaret on Okanagan Lake in 1958, is in its 4th generation of family ownership. The Temagami sits in the OPP Museum in Orillia, restored, gleaming under museum lights, a patrol boat that outlived the company that built it by nearly half a century. A 1947 22-foot Shepard, restored by Allman Boat Works in Muskoka, is held by the Muskoka Marine Museum collection. Restored examples trade in the $50,000 to $135,000 range, depending on size and provenance. And in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, a small company decided to bring the name back. Lars and Olivia Bergerson had established the Bergerson Boat Company in 2008 as an antique wooden boat restorer. After restoring a 27-foot Shepard, they became captivated by the craftsmanship and performance of the historic Shepard Boat Company. In 2018, they acquired the Shepard boat name. They now build new mahogany Shepards, 22, 24, 27, and 30-foot models, with original-style construction but modern engines and amenities. New 22-footers start somewhere south of $200,000. But here is the detail that tells the whole story. To build the new boats, Lars Bergerson hunted down old Shepards that were beyond restoration. Boats rotting in barns, boats abandoned in fields, boats whose hulls had opened and whose frames had broken and whose varnish had long since checked and peeled away to bare gray wood. He pulled them apart to create the patterns. He found the 22-foot pattern boat in upstate New York. He was processing, at last report, the carcass of a ruined 27-footer found in Minnesota. This is how the Shepard brand survives. Not through the plans were thrown out. Not through the jigs were lost. Not through the patterns were discarded when a Los Angeles conglomerate decided they were no longer relevant. The brand survives because a Wisconsin restorer found wrecked boats in American fields and reverse-engineered their shapes, pulling the knowledge out of the wood the way you'd pull a fossil from rock. Canadian craft, American licensed, reverse-engineered from corpses. Chapter 11. The River and the Silence. 3 corporate handoffs in 20 years. Lloyd Shepard to James Hahn, 1958. Runabouts to cruisers. Hahn to Trojan, 1966. Canadian-owned to American-owned. Trojan to Whitaker, 1969. A boat company to a conglomerate line item. Each handoff was rational on its own terms. Each one was defensible. Each one was, by the logic of the moment, probably the best available option. The cumulative effect was the deletion of a 50-year Canadian craft tradition. A craft so good that an American conglomerate bought it twice, only to delete it both times. The Niagara-on-the-Lake Museum holds the Shepherd archive now. The 1949 women's baseball team in matching jerseys. The 1956 Shepherd Jr. outboard. Construction plans for a 1963 28-foot cruiser. Imagery of the 1968 50-foot motor yacht. The cruiser era peak. The museum mounted an exhibition called All Along the Waterfront. The artifacts sit in cases behind glass, carefully labeled, carefully preserved. The institutional memory that the company itself was not permitted to keep. The Antique and Classic Boat Society lists Shepherd alongside Chris Craft, Century, Garwood, Grivet, Hacker, Riva, and Lyman as a recognized classic mark. That's the company Shepherd keeps now. Not in the water, but in the catalogs. Not as a living builder, but as a collectible. Not as an employer, but as a heritage brand. The Niagara River still runs past the foot of Ricardo Street. The current is strong. It always has been, fed by 4 Great Lakes draining through this single channel toward Lake Ontario and the St. Lawrence and the open Atlantic beyond. The water that Lloyd Shepherd tested his first boats in is the same water that runs past the Kings Point condominiums today. The river doesn't know what used to be built on its banks. It carries the same cold, the same current, the same slight greenish cast of deep fresh water moving fast. The condominiums have a terrace. It faces the river. There are Muskoka chairs. Nobody sits in those chairs and thinks about Mahogany. Nobody watches the river and imagines the test runs. A freshly varnished 22-footer sliding off the slip. The Chrysler Crown turning over with that deep burble through the exhaust. The hull settling into the current and then pulling away upstream. The varnish catching the light. The wake spreading out behind in a clean V across water that's been carrying boats for longer than Canada has been a country. That's all gone now. The sound, the smell, the skill. What's left is the river, the chairs, the quiet. And somewhere on the Great Lakes, if you know where to look, a boat that glows like dark honey in the afternoon light. Built by hands that are gone, in a factory that is gone. From plans that nobody kept, fastened with bronze that will outlast everything except the water itself.